Let me say that the content of this paper is not intended to be exhaustive. I will be taking into consideration the connection between the phenomenology of spirit with the science of logic on the one hand, and the Tractatus on the other side, focusing on a few aspects. In particular, we will see how some characteristics of language and logic emerge in Hegel's and Wittgenstein's perspective. But, most important, I will show how Wittgenstein can be used as an instrument in order to show why the speculative proposition cannot be reduced to the absolute knowing, being this paramount for understanding the connection between the phenomenology and the science of logic. Lastly, let me stress that in drawing this connection, my attention will not just focus on showing the affinities, but also in showing some differences between the authors. Now, I will begin taking into consideration the affinity between the speculative proposition of the phenomenology and the logical proposition of the Tractatus. As it is known, the end of the phenomenology is the absolute knowing that consciousness reaches in the final chapter of the 1807 work, when it frees itself from any presupposition, or, in other words, from any opposition that consciousness has with its object. Nevertheless, as one might think, it's not the final chapter which connects the phenomenology to the science of logic. The preface, which, as it is known, is posterior to all the chapters of phenomenology, has both the function of explaining the whole system and of connecting phenomenology to logic through the absolute knowing. In this preface, too, there is one element more in comparison with the final chapter, the speculative proposition, defined as what destroys the general form of judgment, which is understood as the distinction between subject and predicate, considered also as the general structure of an ordinary sentence. Therefore, even though it is called a proposition, it is not an ordinary sentence, and because it is not an instance of language, Hegel does not furnish any examples about it. Rather, it can be seen as the final step of the path of consciousness which has crossed through its shapes. Although on the one hand the term proposition keeps it in a linguistic context, on the other one the term speculative makes one think about logic, as I will show in a moment. Here, one problem arises inasmuch the phenomenology of spirit is not regarded as a work about language. Nevertheless, I follow Kierkegaard when he says that language belongs to consciousness and judgment is the form through which it expresses itself. Therefore, the speculative proposition can be seen not only as the end of the path of consciousness, but of its language. Should we regard the speculative proposition as the passage between phenomenology and logic? In the speculative proposition, a passage or a transition, I mean from phenomenology to logic, cannot be seen, and the reader has to abide by the text. This last talking just about one function of the speculative proposition, the destruction of the structure of judgment. At this point, we can say that one has been left with the destruction of judgment. Beyond that limit, logic is. Now, logic has in common with the above-mentioned proposition the word speculative. I quote, "Their movement, I mean of the moment, which organizes itself in this element into a whole, is logic or speculative philosophy." Since speculative also is linked with the movement and the organization of the moments into a unity, this proposition, I mean the speculative one, can be similarly considered as what gathers into a unity the totality of the previous propositions, demolishing the distinction between subject and predicate at the same time. On the other hand, the fact that logic is defined as speculative, like the proposition, shows not only that there is a connection between the two, but that logic as well destroys the structure subject-predicate, determining logic as the dimension where every difference among the elements of the judgment vanishes into the whole, and determining as logic is not made of judgments, and therefore as logic does not use language as a form of expression. With the speculative proposition, a limit has been reached, a limit that cannot be overcome unless the destruction of the judgment is what is to be found. The speculative proposition is the very limit of it, therefore logic is not language. Here lies the first affinity with Wittgenstein, for whom logic is not expressible, since it is not a language. This demolition can also be seen as the content of judgment which has been completely externalized. Since consciousness can be also considered as, I quote, the spirit as concrete knowing that is immersed in exteriority, in the speculative proposition the content has been completely expressed, having the proposition nothing more to say, as if consciousness were pushed to its extreme possibility. The above mentioned proposition can be considered as what is left from language, which give us no more information. In the Tractatus, the limit is not reached in consciousness, but in language, in the 4th section, which talks about two limiting cases, Grenzfälle, referring to tautologies and contradiction. I want to show the correspondence between tautology and the speculative proposition. They are the, I quote, they are the limiting cases, the disintegration of the combination of signs. It is so because of their characteristic of being always true or always false. To tautology and to contradiction, no definite combination of objects correspond because they do not have sense. And sense depends on object, as you can see from proposition 3. Therefore, the combination of signs that we see in them is only apparent, as apparent are these propositions. This finds a correspondence in the phenomenology, where, as we have seen, the speculative proposition is what destroys the structure of judgment, since tautology and contradiction are compared to the limits of a circle and have the same function of the speculative proposition. Let's see some characteristic of this proposition. Now, the sense is defined as the bipolarity, in the notes of logic, of the ordinary proposition, where truth and falsehood stay together as not yet determined. Thanks to the sense, we comprehend that proposition, even though we do not know whether it is true or false. Nevertheless, proposition can be senseless, as in the case of tautologies or contradiction. It must be recalled that tautologists do not say anything, and tautologists do not say anything because they are sinless, since the sense is the condition for a proposition to say anything. What is then their function? Now, the truth condition or the sense of an ordinary proposition determine the logical space that a proposition occupies, but they also determine the range which is left outside the proposition, that is, the range left open to facts. I quote, "Tautology leaves to reality the whole infinite logical space. Contradiction fills the whole logical space and leaves no point to reality. Neither of them, therefore, can in any way determine reality." Tautology and contradiction are compared to points of a circle, and this means, as Wittgenstein will clarify later, that they work as limits of language, tautology being the internal one and contradiction the external one of it. Therefore, one difference with the speculative proposition is that they do not organize anything, since they are, to use Wittgenstein's words, as 0 points of language. They have not their truth condition, i.e. they do not have sense, because in comparison to an ordinary proposition which has sense, tautology and contradiction are not absolute, but they become absolutely true or false, bedingungslos, losing their sense through the path of language which has reached its end. They have lost their condition in the important respect that they are sinless and not unsinnig. In comparison to unsinnig and with the characteristics of the ordinary proposition which possesses condition, the term loss, which belongs to sinless, confirms a process of deprivation of the conditions of science, which shows how tautologies and contradictions are the endpoints which language has reached. They don't communicate anything except the fact that they say nothing, which in other words means that the content of this proposition can be directly elicited from the form, because the difference between content and form has been vanished. As a proposition, the tautology keeps the properties which are peculiar to language. As something that is logical instead, it prepares to logic. Here lies the correspondence with the speculative proposition. Wittgenstein uses the term Grenze, limit, the idea behind which is that this border is not made to be overcome. It would not be a border otherwise. It's not a case that Wittgenstein talks of a cage referring to language. Language, in fact, is not just like an asymptote, because it doesn't have a tendency towards logic. There is no evidence in the text. Logic and language stay separate dimensions. Furthermore, tautology is the, I quote, tautology is the unsubstantial point at their center. Propositions have come to their internal limit. On the one hand, the tautology is what all the propositions have in common. On the other side, the contradiction is the external limit that vanishes, regarded as that nothing that all the propositions have in common. Through tautology and contradiction, it can be said that language moves in both directions, to the center and to the external limit of it. Tautologies are the logical propositions, and they can be considered as limits that language has reached through an internal path, since it is defined as the unsubstantial center, the path from nonsense to senses. Eventually, due to the destruction of the proposition is nothing what we are left with. This is valid for both Hegel and Wittgenstein. Consciousness and language reach their limit and we do not know anything more. In the phenomenology, consciousness reaches its limit with the speculative proposition. In the Tractatus, in the tautology and contradiction. The conclusion of this first paragraph is the fact that for both Hegel and Wittgenstein, access to logic is not something immediate, rather something mediated through a limit. In Hegel's case, through the speculative proposition, in Wittgenstein, tautology and contradiction. The speculative proposition corresponds to tautologies or logical propositions of the Tractatus, the characteristic of them being a limit. Since we have treated tautology and contradiction together, and since we have seen how close they are, it is important to underline one element more. It has been underlined the correspondence between the speculative proposition and tautologies. Why not then between speculative proposition and the contradictions of the Tractatus? They are both limits. The difference lies in the fact that the speculative proposition is an internal limit and has nothing to do with the contradiction of the Tractatus, which is defined as an external limit which vanishes in all propositions. In the phenomenology, the dialectical process goes on through the contradiction. It can be considered as the limit or the difference between two moments, which needs to be overcome in order to access to the next one. The difference with the Wittgensteinian contradiction is the fact that the Hegelian one is not a proposition, and that in the Tractatus there are no moments to be overcome. Let me anyway say that both Hegel and Wittgenstein use for contradiction the same verb, which is verschwinden, to vanish. Now, up to this point, we have seen two affinities between Hegel and Wittgenstein. Logic is for both not something immediate, but a dimension reached through a path, and the function of limit of the speculative proposition and of logical proposition. Now, we turn to logic. I quote, "The experience that we need in order to understand logic is not that something or other is the state of things, but that something is. That, however, is not an experience. Logic is prior to every experience. That something is so. It is prior to the question how, not prior to the question what." This sentence can be found in the Tractatus a bit before the introduction to a new dimension, the other side of language or nonsense, as it is defined in the preface. This sentence, together with the comparison with the logical proposition of which we have talked before, can make us understand the debated relationship between phenomenology and science of logic. Here, Wittgenstein can serve as an instrument for Hegel's understanding. If the sentence which opens the paragraph were applied to phenomenology, it would be said that consciousness answered the question how through the moments of its experience. On the other hand, since logic is prior to the question how, annuls the experience that consciousness has had. The end coincides with the beginning, in which we lack any determination of the object, so that it can be just said that it is. We need an experience which is at the same time not an experience. This paradoxical claim is made by Wittgenstein to make the reader understand not only that logic cannot be understood since it is not made of propositions which have sense, but also that logic does not come just after language, but is present since the beginning of the Tractatus, exactly as the absolute in the phenomenology. This evokes the debated matter about the presuppositionless of Hegel's logic. The fact that also Hegelian logic, like we find it in the science of logic, can be considered as autonomous from phenomenology shows that logic can annul in a certain sense the experience of consciousness, that something simply is, and not that is so and so, is the first dimension that logic discloses to the reader, as we can infer from the fact that there is not any determination. The formula so and so indicates that something is determined. Indeed, it is worth noticing that in the introduction of the science of logic, Hegel says that we do not know in which world we are when one speaks about a concept, the simplicity of which lies in the fact that the concept can be defined with itself. The fact that we do not know the quality of this word means that the only thing we can say about it is that it simply is. It is also worth remembering that consciousness, which is the subject of the phenomenology, recognizes the object before it as itself at the end of Hegel's book, i.e., the deepest difference vanishes and reveals itself rather as the deepest identity. This identity corresponds to the absolute knowing that in the preface of the phenomenology is defined as A equal A, and that is different from the speculative proposition. Absolute is, as it is known, the passage or the transition between the phenomenology and the science of logic, or, stated differently, between experience and logic. We find it at the end of the phenomenology and at the beginning of the science of logic, this last being presuppositionless. It is as through the first A of the identity finds itself on the other part as if the equal sign transported it. If this is so, phenomenology and science of logic establish a correspondence, not an identity, through the equal sign. Wittgenstein defines expression, I quote, like A equal A, and those derived from them, as expressions which are neither elementary propositions nor is there any other way in which they have sense. Wittgenstein would define the Hegelian absolute in this way, indicating it not as a proposition and as something that doesn't have sense. If Wittgenstein read the phenomenology, he would say that absolute is no proposition, therefore no picture, and that it doesn't have sense. What would Hegel answer? Would Hegel agree saying that the absolute does not have sense, nor is it a proposition? If sense can be considered, according to Wittgenstein, to the conditions of the proposition, then Hegel would agree, inasmuch absolute is with no condition, as etymology says. Nor is it a proposition, since the speculative proposition, which does not coincide with absolute, is the limit beyond which no judgment or proposition can be found. Since the science of logic begins where the phenomenology ends, the absolute, this proposition, the speculative proposition, thanks to its similarity to tautologies, which are internal limits, and become absolute, can be considered as the internal definition of the absolute, whereas A equal A is the positive definition of it. If a phenomenology finds its end in the speculative and then a transition in the absolute, this means that we are talking about phenomenology or science of logic, depending on which side of the equal sign one switches. If it is like that, this shows that phenomenology cannot be reduced to an introduction to the whole Hegelian system, but rather that it is an autonomous work with the same dignity of the science of logic. Nevertheless, it is important here to think about the nature of this relationship. In accordance with what has just been said, it would be coherent to say that between phenomenology and science of logic there is an identity. The problem arises when Hegel himself talks about a correspondence. The relationship between elements of the former and elements of the latter are the same. I quote, "The moment does not appear as this movement of passing back and forth from consciousness or picture thinking into subconsciousness and conversely. On the contrary, its pure shape, freed from its appearance in consciousness, the pure notion, and its onward movement, depends solely on its pure determinateness. Conversely, to each abstract moment of science corresponds a shape of manifest spirit as such. Here, the equal science is unhinged, and one has to pay attention to the fact that the relationship between the two A's is something posited, and therefore differentiated the identity within the within difference, and the deepest difference which becomes the deepest identity. So that the phenomenology and science of logic are equal and different at the same time, with no problem of coherence. The last quotation is also important compared again to the proposition 5.552, where it can be seen that for Hegel, experience is nothing else than the path of consciousness through her moments, which loses its determinateness coming to logic. This path can be considered as the passage from representation, which loses its determinates to logic. Picture thinking, in fact, is also a synonym for the consciousness which is the subject of phenomenology and is put here in comparison with logic. For Wittgenstein as well, logic is where no picture is given, since logic is not made of propositions and therefore is not made of pictures. Since, as I stated at the very beginning, this essay is not intended to be exhaustive, I cannot expect to find a real conclusion. I just have underlined some points of connection between the two authors, for which language and logic stay separate dimensions, differentiated by the equal science which at the same time posits identity. The phenomenology and the Tractatus have the same function of we might call it so, liberation. As Kierkegaard says, the phenomenology frees consciousness from all its oppositions with the object. In the Tractatus, it's the language freeing from itself. It can be seen in proposition 6 and 6.54, where Wittgenstein talks of the ladder that we have to throw away. Both logics, whatever kind they are, underpin the two works, since they are present since the very beginning. The difference is that when phenomenology reaches logic, it ends in order to leave space to the other work, the science of logic, whereas Wittgenstein treats of logic in the same work. Finished.